Thank you. So I'm going to be speaking a bit about our experience of trying to create a decentralized exchange type product which can serve a larger, more mainstream customer base. So first, I just want to give a bit of context about Ethfinex, about our journey and what we're doing, and then I'm going to get quite into a sort of case study of the most recent product which we launched, which was Ethfinex Trustless, and talk about the kind of challenges that we thought we were going to encounter and what we actually encountered after launching this. So Ethfinex launched back in 2017, and we started off with a purely centralized exchange. And our roadmap is along two streams. So both technology and governance, we want to become decentralized. So on the governance side, we started off with a token called the Nectar token, which gets distributed to anyone who trades on the exchange. And the long-term goal is that over time, these will be distributed to all of our traders, and eventually we can end up in a situation where we transition to a decentralized governance structure like a DAO. And along the way, we've been experimenting with voting. So for example, token holders chose which tokens got added onto the platform. And then on the technological side, again, we want to end up with a fully decentralized exchange. And what we've launched so far is a stepping stone towards that called Ethfinex Trustless, which is what I'm going to talk about for most of the rest of the presentation. So why are we doing this? We already have a centralized exchange. What's the point in trying to become decentralized? For us, it's really all about control. So the way that we think this industry, and particularly the finance industry in general, is going to evolve is that people want more control, and we want to be able to serve that whole new customer base that's growing up. People like Melonport who are building decentralized asset management on a blockchain need native exchanges, and we think that only open systems and systems which are actually owned by their customers are going to survive in that kind of ecosystem. So we started off thinking, how can we take the technology we already have, and which I think in some sense does serve a much larger customer base on our centralized exchange, and start to apply some of the same principles to decentralized exchange or decentralized application technology, and kind of cross this typical adoption chasm. So in this typical model, you have early adopters, the kind of people who are willing to put up with all sorts of problems, errors, bugs, and report them, and enjoy the new technology. And then afterwards come the more mainstream users. And these kind of people are not willing to tolerate any sorts of errors or slow speeds. And particularly in trading, of course, when there's a lot of financial value at stake, you have to have a really polished application. And in our view, and I think in quite a commonly held views in this industry, the biggest challenges for that for decentralized exchange were the following 3 points. So commonly people talk about the lack of liquidity, so the fact that decentralized exchanges aren't taking off because there's not enough liquidity. And this is a kind of a chicken and egg problem, and something which we thought needed solving in order to get this to take off. Again, there's the low speed, the fact that on a typical exchange you can place hundreds or even more orders within a second concurrently, whereas on a blockchain you might have to wait many seconds, many blocks before a trade settles. And then the more complex user experience, which is, I think, a challenge with all decentralized applications. So we created this, which is Ethfinex Trustless. It has the look and feel very much of a centralized cryptocurrency exchange, with the main difference being that up at the top, instead of having to sign in to access this, you just connect an Ethereum wallet that you already have. So it removes a whole load of the barriers there. And the big sort of innovation for us was that the order books that you access are actually the same ones that you get on a centralized exchange. So you get all the liquidity benefit that you'd get there, but without having to hand over custody, and you always keep control of your funds and your personal data. So to quickly dive in how that works, essentially, when you're placing an order, you sign it with your Ethereum private key, send it to us, and we have a gateway which checks all the parameters here, and if it's valid, adds it onto our order book exactly the same as for a user who's using it, having given us custody. And those can then be matched together, with the only difference being that so you then get sort of real-time execution, but for settlement, we pull back out your order and submit it to the blockchain, and several minutes later, you'll get a settlement on the blockchain. So that means you can still get concurrent trading with all the benefits. And we were sort of pretty happy with this. We thought, wow, we've kind of solved these three big problems. This is a product which could really be mainstream for decentralized trading. And so we launched it, and not much happened. And we sort of saw for a while volume slightly building up, and we were iterating quickly and making lots of improvements. And within sort of 2 or 3 months, back in December, we started to see volumes really grow. So we saw, for a couple of days, $250,000 every day, $500,000. We passed 1 million, and eventually kind of peaked at about 8 million. And we thought, wow, this must be it. We're suddenly reaching a much larger audience. And when we really looked into the data, the truth was it was still only 100 to 250 daily users, most of them very, very specialized niche arbitrage traders who had identified that they could do very fast arbitrage and there was an opportunity here. But still, we weren't reaching anywhere near a mainstream user base. And when those arbitrage opportunities disappeared, the volume also disappeared. So when we kind of look at the whole industry, the truth is we're still so early in that early adoption curve that really there's, across all these sorts of applications, there's less than 1,000 daily active users, and really the same small group of people using all of them. And so we realized we're still right back at the beginning. We were looking way too early in that curve. And the real challenges that we have to look at to cross into a mainstream user base are so much bigger than what we were looking at all. And there's these typical five problems with trying to get innovation to diffuse to a bit larger audience. And one of the biggest ones here is relative advantage, so actually demonstrating why it's better than an alternative. And I'll go into the rest later, but essentially on all 5 of those topics, we were failing. And the real biggest challenge that kind of sums up all of these is this idea of a frictionless society. So all of the products that we as consumers have gotten used to on the internet, but also in trading, if you're working it full time, are all about removing barriers, removing friction, removing often the need to kind of think about what you're doing and take a choice. So there's a lot of choice architecture going on to kind of drive you in one way. And blockchain is definitely a very strong reaction to that. So people want to take back control, to be able to make choices, but it means there's a trade-off. It means you have to deal with certain things. You have to have responsibility for what you're doing as well. And I think something that really sums it up is this kind of quite famous stat that in 2009, Amazon found that 100 milliseconds of additional latency for a consumer buying a product reduced their sales by 1%. And you can imagine, in comparison now, when people are even more used to this sort of instant now culture, that the cost of 15-second block times and having a pop-up which you have to sign to do any sort of transaction is absolutely, another couple of orders of magnitude in blocking this from happening. So we started to look and really go back to the drawing board and realize how naive we'd been, and thinking of how we can actually build something that can kind of cross that chasm to more mainstream users. And we started off with user interviews. So we were in quite a unique position of having a centralized exchange with a lot more users, that we could actually start quite a systematic process of taking people who were trading actively, either on Ethfinex or other centralized exchanges, and interview them, get them to use our product for the first time. And this kind of completely shattered the last illusions we had. Most of them didn't actually have, or like a huge proportion of them didn't even have Ethereum wallets. So when they come to our site and it says connect your wallet, they may have been trading for years, but they would say, well, I have my wallet on my Ether wallet, how do I connect it? And they wouldn't understand, that there's a private key under there. Questions about gas were just everywhere. And these 5 factors became really clear in different ways. The complexity one is obvious, but the compatibility with their existing applications that they use was again really far off, and the relative advantage was surprisingly low. So yes, they had control, and the fact that they wouldn't get hacked if a centralized exchange was hacked, but this didn't mean anything to them. The one area where we really saw a strong take to it was on speed, surprisingly. So the fact that it could be faster for certain activities, like arbitrage, because you don't have to wait for a centralized exchange to process your deposits and withdrawals and settle your transactions, where you're pretty helpless waiting for support, for example. And that was the one area where we thought we were weakest, which was speed, was the one thing which people did seem to take to on relative advantage. And of course, risk being a huge factor that you can easily lose your funds. And what came out of this, and what we think is where we really need to focus, is on this education about it being a trade-off. So while you do get more control, that also means you have responsibility for your funds and for everything you're doing. So in the case of our exchange, that means no sign-ups, no loss of access to funds. It's resilient, but there's no safety nets. And the second sort of area, a big area that we saw was all about wallet onboarding. So the biggest drop-off for us for new users coming to the site was always around connecting your wallet. So we had 4 options at the beginning: MetaMask, Ledger, and Trezor, which are both hardware wallets, and your key store file. And the majority of people, especially if they didn't have a wallet, would come, and their only option was basically to go to another site, install MetaMask, set it up securely, be scared of what's going to happen to their funds, go get some Ethereum and transfer it in, and then come back and trade, which just didn't happen. So we started running some experiments with different types of wallets. So the first one we added was something called Portis. So this, for example, is much more familiar to anyone who has used a normal website. So when you press connect, you get this pop-up where you can choose to register or sign in, and you register using a normal, or sign in using a normal email address and password. So it means you can use it cross-device. It becomes much more sort of comfortable and familiar for most people, and they can do it without leaving the site. And so just from these sorts of things, we suddenly see sort of big shifts in the number of new users who are able to start using and who then convert to active traders. So if we look at a couple of weeks after we or a couple of months after we added this, Portis is then up to 14% or so of the wallets that are connecting to trade, and the conversion rate of new people visiting the site to traders was also much, much higher. So those kind of basic things became really clear as being important. And so for us now, the real kind of mission has shifted quite a lot. So our aim is still to launch a fully decentralized exchange, and in fact, we've been working on that now for quite a long time. It's probably going to be within this next 6 months that we'll be ready from a technological point of view to launch this. So it's something that's much more advanced than Trustless in our view, in terms of its performance, its scalability, in terms of the order types that are possible, in terms of the privacy it gives a user. It really rivals a centralized exchange. And yet we don't feel at the moment that if we launched it, it would be any more, or basically would be any more successful than Trustless or any of the other decentralized exchange offerings out there, because of the underlying problems that we've seen. And so if we don't tackle those, particularly things about onboarding people, about educating them, about why it's important and what the trade-off is that they're making, there's almost no point in us going ahead and launching something like that. So for us at the moment, the biggest focus is on more user feedback, on more improvements in terms of our UX, and we're going to keep experimenting, sharing these sorts of tests that we're doing, and we hope that it's interesting, and hope that by the time that we do start to launch a more fully finished decentralized exchange, that it will be able to go to mainstream traders. Thank you.